Welcome to Hope Blooms, a podcast from the Early Pregnancy Loss Association.
At EPLA, we seek to support women and families suffering early pregnancy loss by providing resources, education, and community. It is our vision that no one suffers miscarriage alone.
Welcome back to Hope Blooms. I'm Early Pregnancy Loss Association's President, Maria Servold.
And I'm Emily Carrington, the Executive Director. And with us today, we have a special guest, Pastor Everett Henes. Thank you for joining us.
It's really a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
We're excited to talk to you. Pastor Henes is the pastor of a local congregation here, the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. And they have worked really closely with us and have been very receptive to our materials and have really modeled a way to help people in their congregation. So we're excited to talk to you and about your experience. And I think maybe we'll just start at the beginning. Can you sort of tell us your own experience with miscarriage before we start talking about congregational experiences?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been married to my wife, Kimberly, she's tolerated me for 26 years so far. We have 5 children that are mostly all adults, but in the sort of, as we look at our kids, we had them all very sort of quickly, one right after another. And there's a very large gap between our 2 daughters, our youngest 2. And that's because while I was at Westminster Seminary, Kimberly was pregnant with our 5th child at the time. At about 10 weeks, she miscarried. So we walked through that. Honestly, there wasn't any resources out there. There wasn't really anybody that we could talk with, although I think this is a common experience for women who experience miscarriages. When it happens, all of a sudden, they begin to find out how many others have experienced it, which was helpful for Kimberly as we processed through that as a family. With our children, we were so excited. There's another one on the way, and then there was loss, and our kids were all very young at the time, but it was something that we were able to work through, to pray through, and then eventually we would have our youngest child. And again, there's that large gap between the 2. Yeah, so that's our experience.
So that would have been almost 20 years ago.
Not quite.
Okay.
The number 4 is 19. She just got married, and number 5 is 16.
Okay.
So yeah, probably about 17 or so years ago.
Right.
So I guess it's getting,
that is almost...
it's getting close to 20 years ago. Okay, I'm old. It's good.
The time passes.
Yeah.
Well, I just mentioned that because we often talk about sort of the progression of the way culture hasn't changed. Our first losses being now almost 10 years ago, and how much things have changed in that 10 years, but even more so, I think.
In like the cultural conversation about miscarriage.
Yeah. I think it's, so in my own studies, I've kind of called it the unintended consequence of the pro-life movement. And I don't think it's a bad thing. I think it's a very good thing to bring awareness to it and to be, to kind of acknowledge and to learn how to bring resources together to help couples who are dealing with it. But you go back in history and it's something that has been going on, since time immemorial.
Right.
And the focus on the unborn child, I think, since Roe v. Wade and the development of the pro-life movement has really brought a spotlight on it that has left, I think, sometimes, especially Christians, uncertain how to grieve the loss. And I think that's the biggest part, is since it's always been that there's always been a grief associated with it, helping Christians to learn kind of how to process and think about that. And the fact that it's okay to grieve. It's right to grieve the loss of a life at whatever stage.
Right. I think that's something that we all, I don't know that struggle is the right word, something that we're working to, right? Like giving that space for women to grieve, to validate that it really is the loss of a life. I think technology has an interesting part of that too, that we saw a little heartbeat before our loss, that there was this affirmation that I knew a whole lot more than my mother, who experienced a loss now 37, so almost 40 years ago. There was a disconnect, but still a grief. And so as I think that's progressed, I think that there's this interesting push, at least in our culture. So I guess let's talk about at EPLA, we provide the resources, the education, the information. We've talked about this. We've talked a lot about, I think on this podcast, that we provide, our care kits to nurses and doctors. We also do a lot of direct services straight to friends, ask us for a kit, and we send them. But one of the challenges for us is getting these care kits in the right people's hand at the right time. Because with these early losses, maybe you haven't established care with your doctor. Maybe it starts before you knew. Maybe there's just a whole lot of reasons these fall through the cracks. So while we love doctors and nurses and ERs, we realize that's not our only front line. And I think one of our other important front lines are churches and clergy and those who care for families. Mm-hmm. So in many ways, you all solve a challenge for us of that frontline resources. But if you could talk a little bit more about your challenges sort of on that front line with families. You have a young and active congregation, a lot of young families, bustling with lots of children. But sort of the sad side of that is anywhere we know that there's, a lot of children in a room, there's also a lot of children missing as 1 in 4 end in pregnancy loss. So can you tell me a little bit about your experience and challenges as a pastor?
Yeah, so I do think that having experienced it with my wife those 17 years ago helped me to be aware of it. I do think that I'm in a tradition, as I think maybe all of us are, at least here, that, there's male clergy. And I think that can sometimes present certain challenges. I mean, men are not always comfortable with, dealing with this kind of loss. And part of that's because it happens completely outside of us, right? And so I don't want to bash on men because of that. It's just in my own ministry, I'm trying to help men learn how to shepherd their wives through loss. On the church front, what we've really sought to do is lean on our wives and to encourage them. So usually what happens is, I will get word from a husband that there's been a loss. And you're right, we've had a lot within our congregation, early pregnancy, but also loss of children. And when I get that word, we just we have things in place, right? We have some of our women who have the packets that come from the LPA. And so they make sure to get those to the women. We have women who have experienced. And so they reach out. We set up meal trains so that, food is taken care of. I immediately begin to email and to be in touch with the couple, to visit in the home. We have a liturgy that we use for pregnancy loss to help them kind of pray through and to commit that child to the Lord. And that's been very helpful for the couples, at least the ones that we've been able to do that with. And then sort of on the other side, so since my own work right now is in helping husbands shepherd their wives through grief, but really specifically miscarriage, I have a series of emails that starts to go out to the husband, usually 2-3 times a week to encourage because what I've noticed is that couples will have a tendency, husband and wife, grieve differently and they can move apart from one another. And so my goal is to help them kind of come together and to process things together and to recognize that there's no roadmap, right? There are some couples that experience it and they seem to move through it much more quickly. Whereas we have other couples that, it'll be a year, 2 years later, and they're still kind of struggling. What we want to do, first of all, is tell them that's okay. There's no set time limit where, you just say, well, you should be over this by now, right? That just doesn't happen. And so all of that kind of goes into place and we've developed that over time. So that's, it's not like I showed up here and all of a sudden we had this. It almost kind of developed, I would say, alongside of your work, right? Your work has been such an encouragement for us to think about this as it is brought to the fore for people that this really is a loss, right? It really is a true loss and one that can be grieved and ought to be grieved. So I'm not sure if I'm answering the question correctly, but that's kind of the process. So we have practical, we have spiritual, and then my own work with husbands tends to continue on. And then the women gather around the wife and then I check in with them as well. I mean, our elders are involved, all of that. We kind of go at it from many fronts.
What I think a key thing you said at the beginning of that answer was that there's like a process in place, right?
Yes.
And that's the thing that I think is often missing in other settings or whatever, right? Like you sort of like, oh, this happened, it kicks into gear this series of events, which, I was thinking about our own church where, before someone dies, and there's a funeral, there's like this whole thing, you know, like this person does this, person does this. The ladies plan the lunch, right? Like there's all these things.
It exists, yeah.
And there's not really a system in place for a particular early loss, but it's like, well, why not?
Right? And I think it's already, I think what you said, it's already there. Like those things that you said that you do are things that churches do and do well, right? Make meals, pray for people, shepherd them. And you know, many healthy churches that are doing that for other
events,
deaths or for sickness. You know, we've said before, if someone has an illness, a cancer diagnosis or some sort of illness, a death in the family, churches know what to do, or they should know what to do.
That's true. And I do think part of the challenge is, so, you know, part of being pastor of a congregation that has a very young age skew. So I haven't done a lot of older funerals. Right. I've done a disproportionate amount of other funerals, right? Tragic funerals. And I do think that one of the realities I've had to deal with is that sometimes, and I don't know what the percentage is, but I've had couples who've experienced miscarriage, and they've just pulled completely back away from the church. Like, you know, you want to bring them a meal and it's like, leave it outside the door. And they just pulled back and we haven't seen them for months, sort of thing. And so while we have processes in place, it works if, you know, if the family is able to receive it.
Well, and that's a challenge. I mean, that's a challenge with anything, and I think we talk about this too, right? With giving space to grieve. Miscarriage is this intensely private event as well, right? So giving that respect and that space, and that not everyone's going to want the same.
I think there's still, despite the way the world has changed and everything we've done, sometimes a shame about it, right?
Well, and I do think, if I could interject here, that I think part of the equation is when does a couple announce that they're pregnant, right? And so, you know, one of my children, his wife, due any minute now. And so we're so excited. We're going to be grandparents. I mean, my wife is over the moon. She spent so much of my money already. But, you know, when they came to us and they said, you know, we want you to know, but we're not sure we're going to tell everybody. One of the things we talked to them about was, you know, so there is a possibility of miscarriage. We don't think there's no reason for us to think it'll happen. But one of the things we said is it's hard for people to grieve with you when they haven't rejoiced with you.
Yes.
And that doesn't mean that I'm trying to make a rule like, well, you have to announce. But so some of what I've seen in my pastoral ministry is, you know, a couple, you know, maybe tells me, or, you know, but they don't want to announce. So we're not praying for them publicly, praying for them privately. And then there's a miscarriage. And then because they're grieving alone, they feel even more distanced from the congregation. And they can sometimes, what can happen is they can become bitter. Right? Because, well, they're just not recognizing my grief. We want to. And so we have all of those systems we have in place. They will spring alive, whether it's an announced pregnancy or not. Sometimes I will email the congregation and say, pregnancy, miscarriage in the same email. And so all of those systems are in place, but it is a little bit harder for the couple sometimes to feel that connection with people, because there was no miscarriages I mean, I don't mean to downplay it. I mean, but it's in a sense a real letdown. Like, you're so excited, you're going to have a baby. If nobody else has gotten excited with you, it's hard for them to feel the same grief.
Right. Whereas if some person who's like 93 and everyone knows in the church, you know, they've had this whole life, everyone
and
knows
you share
them,
memories and you
exactly.
share the loss. And I think that is something that's really hard about the miscarriage grief. And I know I have felt like some things that we even say over and over again, like, you're not alone, doesn't always bring me comfort, because also, like, my baby is unique. It's not just one of many. So sometimes it's like, I don't want to be alone, but I want to be alone, but I want to be.
That's right.
Messy, right?
Grief is so messy. And so one of the things we've also done is we've done training for our congregation on grief. Just, you know, here's some resources. Let's talk about it. And, you know, I'll bring it up in my preaching. You know, sometimes I've gotten pushback. You know, we have some folks in our congregation will say, why do you talk about suffering so much? You know, like, you just keep bringing it up. look around.
Yeah.
Like there's a lot of suffering in the congregation. And sometimes, sure, somebody can say, well, they're suffering compared to. Oh, yeah. You can always compare it to something worse. Yes. But when you're in the middle of a storm, you're the one getting drenched. You're the one suffering. You're the one going through it. And we want to, how do you practically not just say you're not alone, but really come alongside of them? Mm-hmm. So sometimes that's messy. Like I'll get texts at all hours of the day from, people who are in various stages of grief. I know sometimes I'll get a text that's just full of colorful words, and I'll say, I see where they're at. That's where they're at. And I know because of my own training, my own, working with people through grief, like, okay, well, now this is the tact that I take, this is how I help them. But again, I think it becomes, as a pastor, you have to become acquainted with grief, right? That's one of the texts in scripture, Isaiah 53, Christ is acquainted with grief. Grief makes us uncomfortable. Right. When Jesus went to the tomb of Lazarus and he was agonized, he sensed the grief that he experienced as he is there facing death. Right. Not his own death, but the death of somebody he loved. It's an uncomfortable place. And we immediately want to withdraw from that. And sometimes that's why couples pull apart. Sometimes that's why people at the church just, kind of, and I saw this early on with some of the miscarriages that some of our early folks faced, was people just, wanted to sort of, oh, how are you, from a distance. Right. And so it took time to encourage and train and just sort of, bring people to come near to them. And not everybody's comfortable with that. And that's okay. Some people are just going to send, a card or send a meal, and they're not going to come alongside of them. My wife and I, we will visit them in their home, pray with them, grieve with them, but other people aren't going to be necessarily comfortable with that. And that's okay.
Well, one thing it sounds like too, and I think one of the challenges with miscarriage, one thing we've been thinking about, or we've blogged about it, and I had some other podcasts on it, is giving these women and families dignity. So we have the grief and we have the loss and we have the death, but then we also have the physical event of miscarriage, which is not dignified, or at least might not be.
Not pleasant.
It's not pleasant.
And I'm not speaking from experience. That's where I definitely lean on my wife and other women in the church to come alongside of them.
Exactly. And that's exactly, I've found myself, with our work, being in these settings and either talking to pastors or business owners, potential donors, and suddenly I'm like, and we have all these great resources. And then I'm pulling out like pads and sanitary items. And I suddenly feel like I'm talking about my period with my dad, and that's not even, and that's in sort of there's no layer of grief or shame or emotions. But I say all that to say, I think it's important that we're aware of what the situation is, but then that there's a multifaceted approach, that it might not be appropriate for the pastor to be the one bringing the pads.
Yeah.
And now I will also argue, like with our large miscarriage care kits, that if this is what a woman needs, this is what a woman needs. Oh, no,
absolutely.
And getting her the right supplies is the dignified thing to do. We can't let her just pretend it's not going to happen.
Well, that's right. And that's the other thing that I think is helpful is for some of our women who've experienced it, and they've all experienced it in different ways, right? There's no, generally speaking, no two miscarriages are identical. And so they're able to provide perspectives of what to expect, I mean, there's the what to expect when you're expecting, what to expect when you're no longer expecting, right? And so the women can come alongside and provide, and that's where I love my wife. She has frank conversations with wives, with women who've experienced it, to say, this is, these are some of the things that your body's going to go through.
And doctors have really, I pray this is getting better, but our experience has been doctors have failed to have that conversation, frankly.
Well,
or they sugarcoat it,
Right.
That was one of the first things when we first started doing this, was everyone in that first meeting was like, I was told XYZ. It was not that.
Absolutely not.
Well, and part of that could be because a lot of doctors are men. I accompanied my wife to just an appointment just the other day. She asked me to be there because she felt that her doctor was being dismissive. Now, it's not for miscarriage or anything like that, but I thought, okay, so you just want a really large man to sit in the room and to say, we need these tests.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And I think that having that village of women and that collective education, because while everything is different, there's still, like, as I keep hearing stories, there's this understanding unified story that I never got from my first doctor that was just very like, yeah. And I look back at how naive and unprepared I was and how important it is that we have those villages, right? Our communities, our churches, that collective knowledge of women and families caring for each other. I want to talk a little bit more. You brought this up that you are doing dissertation research on men shepherding their wives through miscarriage. And I guess this narrows too. We've talked about the doctor, the clergy, the church as a whole, and now sort of inside the family and taking care of each other. Tell us more about what you're doing.
Yeah. So, part of this comes from just having met with one of our families, one of our couples that had early on in our congregation experienced miscarriage. And we walked out and I just asked my wife, I said, how did I do? Not in that case. I actually wasn't asking how I did in that case. I asked, how did I do when you experienced miscarriage? And she reassured me that I wasn't a complete tool, which she always does. And I'm always very thankful for that. But I just began to think about it because I get this, I don't want to be overly dramatic, but when I leave the home, when my wife and I leave, when the church goes back to doing the church things, the door closes and the husband and wife are left alone. I mean, not alone in the sense that, they'll never see anybody again. Of course they will, but all those hours they have to spend together. And I just began to have a burden for how can I help husbands shepherd their wives? That's the call of a husband. That's where my research begins. The call of the husband is to love and protect and provide. But I think really the word I want to use is shepherd, to care for his wife in an intimate, in an intentional kind of way. And then the more that I experienced it in the church and the more reading I did on it, just the more I became convinced that oftentimes husbands have no clue. And I think, and again, I don't want to dump on husbands because it happens outside of their bodies. They don't experience it. It's one of those things that I used to tell my wife all the time, like, I'm so jealous. You get to feel the baby inside of you, right? Like what a privilege. But that also means that the loss she feels inside of her in a significantly different way. And it's not that I can help husbands, understand that necessarily, but I can help them learn how to not pull back. Because that's typically the guy's approach. Men have the audacity to deal with their grief by not dealing with it. They go to work, they pour themselves into other projects, all of those kinds of things. And I want them to intentionally move toward their wife. This is the language that I use because oftentimes in conflict in marriage, but also in grief, they move away from one another. So I want a husband to move toward his wife, even if his wife isn't moving toward him. Like that's not the purpose of my work is to help a husband take the lead in moving toward his wife. So I'm talking about the call of the husband. I'm talking about helping a husband understand grief, because again, men just tend to experience it fundamentally differently. And so to help them understand grief, both their own grief, because I think that is something that husbands need to do better, is to recognize and to process and grieve the loss of their child, but then to understand their wife's grief. And then it's a series. So it's 3 chapters, and then is what I'm envisioning. And then followed by sort of a series of 40 devotionals, with prayers that will help the husband focus attention for the family on the big picture, looking at who God is, because, in the midst of grief and sorrow and difficulty, it's hard to remember that God is good and God is faithful. So kind of beginning with those big things and then sort of working its way down to just reminding them of the glorious truths of the gospel and of hope and of resurrection, all of those things to encourage the couple to process and work through grief. And I don't want to say come out, somehow better. I don't think anybody comes out better from loss. I just remember we had a couple in our church, and they lost a little girl. It wasn't early childhood loss. It wasn't early pregnancy loss. It was a 3-week-old baby whose heart stopped. I remember just having a meeting with them about a year later. And the wife just said to me, she said, I've learned things about God and his love and his goodness that I wouldn't have learned otherwise. And I just thought, that's what I want to try to help facilitate. And I had been part of that. I'd helped that in some way. So I had to go back and think about, okay, what did I do? How did I, how do we do the right things on accident? Yeah. And so I'm just trying to put something, nothing extensive, but just put something of substance in the hands of husbands to prepare them and help them work through and process this with their wives.
Well, and I think this idea of, working through and processing doesn't make it go away, but also there are other seasons and there are seasons of joy and can be worked through. It's not insurmountable. Grief is, we can enter this pit of grief and be there.
Well, and the way I like to explain it to the husbands is it's like getting into an accident. You'll likely walk with a limp. You'll still walk, but it'll always be with a limp. Right. So like I said, every time I see my daughters, there's a big gap between them. It's the biggest gap out of all of our children. And we know why. And there's a sadness as to the why. That doesn't take away the joy of our youngest. Right. There's lots of joy there, but it still is something that we remember and that we worked through together and that we came out on the other side. And again, that sounds clinical and I don't mean it to, but we intentionally spent time together, my wife and I. And I remember at the time when it happened, we went away. I just took time away from school, from work, and we just said, let's just take the family away and just spend time together. So that was one of the things that we did to kind of help us process, think about. Again, process makes it sound clinical. It makes it sound like, you work through it, you put it on a shelf and it's done. It's never done. Right. I've never met somebody who just says, oh, yeah, I got over that. Pregnancy loss, child loss, loss of a spouse. And grief is not something you get past or get over. It's something you learn to walk with.
I saw a great illustration recently of grief and how you deal with it. It's like ball in a cup or something. And it's like the grief doesn't get smaller, but you grow around it. So it's like your capacity it never goes away, but you can grow and change around it in a way that is more comfortable or
right.
Well, and I think that there's also, so yes, I'm a pastor, so I don't believe that, anything is wasted in our lives. And, the Apostle Paul writes in 2 Corinthians about the God of all comfort who comforts us so that we can comfort others. Right. And so I think about, the various losses in our congregation. And if nobody else had experienced those losses except that one couple, how hard that would be for them. But others can come around them and show them that, that continues to be life even after death. And that's an important truth that we have to revisit, because if not, then our grief just overwhelms us. It becomes debilitating. And again, my goal is to write something that will help husbands to understand their grief, understand their wife's grief as best as they can. And I'm less concerned about them understanding it because everybody experiences it differently. And one day you'll be laughing and the next day you'll be crying, and that's okay. But to just not be afraid of it.
So how would you, or do you have a summary of the difference sort of between the husbands and the wife experience, which isn't fair. We're painting huge broad strokes here, but sort of what's your quick summary of where that disconnect or difference is?
I think I could summarize it in the way that my wife and I go to sleep at night. I close my eyes and I just go to sleep. See? Thank you.
Oh, man.
And my wife has to put on distractions to keep her mind somehow occupied. To wind it all down. Right. And I'm looking at her going, just close your eyes. Just go to sleep.
Right.
Like, just turn your brain off, right? So I do think that broad strokes, men can more easily compartmentalize. And women, for, again, broad strokes, it permeates everything. And so those two just differences alone, I think, are an important aspect to thinking about how each one is going to experience grief differently. And just because those are generalizations doesn't mean that they're always true. Right? I have men that I've worked with that it permeates everything, and I've had women that I've worked with who they compartmentalize. So these are just broad stroke differences, but I do think that there is a sense in which they process through it or they just handle it differently that the husband ought to be aware of. And again, for me, the key really is, if I can use an illustration, I'm a pastor, I can do that, right? Is that I grew up with a dad who's a backyard mechanic. Now, I'm not a backyard mechanic, but I'm not afraid of cars. Because I've been underneath them, I've worked with them, I've pulled an engine apart with my dad, I've been yelled at because I held the light wrong. Like, all of those things have happened, and so I'm not afraid of them. And I think just the more that you know about grief and about the processes and everything that goes on, you're less afraid of moving toward it.
Yes.
And so you're not as likely to pull away from it. So if I can help husbands in that way, I will consider that to be helpful. And I will say there are books out there for women who've experienced miscarriage. I have not found a single book for husbands experiencing miscarriage and helping their wives and coming alongside of them. So this is something that, I mean, there's just nothing out there that I've found that I can just simply put in the hands of husbands. There's books about grief generally, but not that bring marriage and the husband's called to shepherd and love his wife together with the grief of miscarriage. And so that's kind of what sort of sparked my interest in this project.
Yeah. And I think that's a lagging. We see sort of the same, and we're starting to see little, and we don't do this, but I know others who do, little dad kits and dad, you know, so the resources for the mom led the way. And then there's sort of been a lagging, like, he needs something too. And I think that's good. Well, not that it's lagging, but that it is following and coming.
Yeah, it's following and coming, and in the right order, I think, because again, in miscarriage, it happens to the wife, to the woman specifically. And so I think that it's something, I think that needs to be the priority. But that's actually what my work is trying to do, is to prioritize where the wife is and to help the husband to be able to understand that and to do something and to come alongside rather than pull away.
Right. Well, thank you. So do you have thank you so much for joining us today. I think that's all we
I was just going to say, we'll be sure to post about that book when it's done.
When your dissertation is done.
We'll be sure to share it.
Yeah, we will look forward to that. I think that's a great natural place for this conversation to go, as we sort of started talking about 37 years ago and my mother said the difference between her care 37 years ago and my care 9 years ago wasn't that big of a difference. And I think she found that kind of shocking.
Yeah.
And I want to say that in the last 10 years, it has gotten better. And that there is movement toward the realization and from all fronts. So we are thankful for the whole front line of care for women. So thank you for your care and service and helping us get our services out and your work on that.
Absolutely. It's always a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for listening to Hope Blooms, a podcast from the Early Pregnancy Loss Association.
To learn more about how we and you can support women suffering early pregnancy loss, visit our website at miscarriagecare.com or find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Thank you for listening.